Hello everyone, my name is Matt Callahan. I am Economic Regeneration Manager for Swansea Council, and the purpose of today's video is to give you a briefing on a brand new grant scheme which we are launching called the High Street Helper. So over the next 15-20 minutes or so, we'll take you through the details of this scheme, particularly because it is a new scheme, identifying what's eligible, what the claim and application process look like. So first thing then, a bit of an overview. I say this is a brand new grant scheme. It is a new funding programme entirely called the Economic Growth Fund, and this is funded directly through Swansea Council itself. So it's not central government money, it is directly from Swansea Council itself. So the purpose of the grant then, so it's a grant potentially of up to £30,000, so potentially a fairly significant sum of investment into new high street businesses. A grant of up to £30,000 to support individuals starting a new business in high street premises located within either Swansea city centre itself or one of our district centres, and this includes Clydach, Gorsinan, Pontedilais, Morriston, Mumbles, Sketty or Upland. And there are specific areas within those district centres that I'll come on to discuss in just a moment. But in terms of Swansea City itself, that could also include the indoor market itself. So the funding stream, I say it's a pot overall of £30,000 in terms of the total grant, but that is made up of two constituent parts. The first of which is £25,000 towards and to help cover startup costs. So this is basically aligned to the pre-start grant that we've offered for a number of years. It's basically that scheme. So that might cover equipment, marketing, stock, that kind of thing. The reason that this particular grant or this High Street Helper is different is that on top of those startup pre-start costs, we are now able to offer an additional £5,000 as like a bolt-on, if you like. And this is able to support additional overheads that you would come to encounter if taking on a bricks and mortar physical high street premises. And those overheads would be to cover the first 3 months of trading in that premises and would include rent, business rates and energy. But again, I'll come on to cover more of this detail. So think of it as a £30,000 grant, but split into two distinct particular sections, the 25k for startup costs, and then the separate distinct 5k costs to cover the overheads for the first 3 months. Overall goal, the overall purpose of this scheme is to help bring about new retail and hospitality ventures to help get them off the ground and then contribute towards our town and district centres throughout Swansea. So who could apply? So again, it's best to think of this as something very much aligned to our pre-start grant. So it's available to individuals who are perhaps becoming self-employed. They're starting a brand new business for the first time. But importantly, crucially for this High Street Helper grant, you must be committing to bricks and mortar stores within high street premises, within those particular areas that I mentioned. If you're not taking on those physical bricks and mortar high street premises, but you are launching a business, I would refer you back to the main pre-start grant, of which there'll be a separate video on our YouTube channel. So in terms of eligibility, this scheme is specifically designed for enterprises, for business that are not already established and operational. So it's for brand new businesses that are not already up and running. In order to qualify for that, there are three eligibility gateways that you can pass through to complete your claim and say become eligible for this grant. The first of which is to register the business with Companies House. If you're going down the sole trader route, the second of which is to register yourself with HMRC and obtain a UTR number. And the third, if those first two are not available to you, would be to apply for and supply a brand new first time business insurance certificate. So to qualify for this grant, you must be able to meet at least one of those three criteria to demonstrate that this is a brand new business. Whichever of those three you choose, it's vitally important that you don't enable that before you have applied for the grant and had your grant approved. The point at which you would trigger whichever one of those three that you wanted to become eligible for this grant would be after the panel has approved your grant and when you submit your claim. So whichever of those three you choose, whatever you do, don't trigger that eligibility criteria before you have applied for and had your grant approved. It's also important to mention that this is not eligible for anyone with an existing business either in Swansea or elsewhere. This scheme is specifically designed for brand new first-time entrepreneurs. So I've mentioned location a little bit. The business must be located within high street premises, located within one of the aforementioned transforming town boundaries of Swansea's district centres. So just to give you an example, I won't run through all of the areas, but to give you an idea of what the map of that area looks like, this is the example of Gorsinan. So it is that high street area plus a little bit extra. So what will happen is when you first apply for your grant, when you first seek an application form from us, we will ask you where your identified location is that you're going to be taking on. We'll check the address of that, check the postcode, and we have individual maps, so we'll be able to tell you fairly quickly whether or not that falls within the transforming town high street helper eligible area, of which case you will be entitled to that additional £5,000 on top of the pre-start grant. But broadly speaking, it's on the main high street trading area, central business district area, if you like, of those individual areas that I mentioned just a moment or so ago. So I said before, you need to think of this as two separate grants. In terms of what the eligibility and what the maximum grant for those respective elements of the grant looks like. For the startup element, the maximum grant is up to £25,000. The minimum grant for that is £500. So for the first £2,000 of that £25,000, it's 100% grant funded. That's to say that there is no match funding contribution required from yourselves as applicants whatsoever for that first £2,000. Any grant requested between £2,000 and £25,000 has a 50% match attached to it. That's to say for every pound that we put in as funders, you would need to put in £1 yourself, all the way between £2,000 and £25,000. So we've got slightly different intervention rates between the first £2,000 and anything above that. So the High Street Helper is designed to cover your overheads. And there's a maximum of £5,000 towards that overall contribution. So in terms of your overheads, the idea behind this High Street Helper is to help you get yourself up and running as a business within those high streets. And we recognise, we appreciate that it may take a little time for you to get yourself established, people to know that you're there, for people to understand and recognise that you do have that presence and get the footfall through the door of your business. So it's a tapered grant for the first 3 months. So for the first month of you being in that premises, 95% of your overheads, that's rent, rate, energy costs, would be covered. On month 2, that falls down to 50%. And on month 3, 25% of your overheads, your rent, your rate, your energy would be covered up to that maximum value of £5,000. I'll come on to what's covered a bit in just a moment, but we can also cover potentially fit out costs for your premises that wouldn't be eligible under the main 25k startup fund, and the flat rate for any fit out costs that you may incur or may want to make subject to this grant is a flat 50%. So tapered on your overheads for the first 3 months, business rates, rent costs, energy costs, and a flat 50% intervention rate for any fit out costs that you may have. How you make up that £5,000 between your overheads and your fit out costs is entirely up to you, but just understand that that limit is £5,000, and how that £5,000 is made up is at your discretion and for you to make judgments upon how you think that grant funding would be best applied for in your particular circumstance. So taking the 25k startup costs in the first instance, again, completely aligned to what is eligible under the pre-start grant. So most commonly, we would fund equipment or tools to help you establish yourself within the business. You'd know better than I would what they may be, but equipment and tools associated with you establishing your high street premises. Website development, business software. So maybe you want to develop a website to allow you to trade online in addition to your bricks and mortar stall. That will be eligible. Any training or accreditation that you require to allow you to undertake whatever your business activity may be. For retail premises, we can cover stock, and that's quite a frequent ask for our particular grant. The main caveat to this is that we can fund stock, but any single line of expenditure needs to be above £25 in value. Anything below that is a bit of a administrative headache for us, and therefore we wouldn't be able to cover that. But any individual lines of stock above £25 can be considered as part of this grant application. Any accountancy or company formation costs and any social media or marketing costs can be covered, but it's important to highlight that under this we cannot fund ongoing campaigns. So say, for example, you wanted to take on a paid 12-month campaign to boost your presence on Instagram or Facebook. We can in theory fund those, but we cannot fund those ongoing costs for those 12 months. If you were going to do that, you would need to pay that entire 12 months upfront at the point of application, and then obviously ensure that was delivered. But that would be at your own risk and your own discretion to make that decision. So it would be an eligible cost, but we can only fund for that particular claim window and not the full rolling 12-month campaign that you may have associated with that. So those are our startup costs. I've mentioned what is eligible. It's probably worth noting at this time just any elements of your startup costs that are not eligible, and these are things that we do occasionally get asked for. So we cannot fund vehicles. So if, for example, you wanted a van to be associated with your retail business, vehicles in any way, shape or form is not something that we can fund under this or any of our other any of our grant schemes that are available. We cannot fund staff costs, we cannot fund salaries, that will be eligible. Again, it's important to remember that we are separating these out as two separate grant funds. So if you were to put rent, rate, energy costs or fit out costs, that would not be eligible under the startup element of this grant. All those costs need to be put separately in your High Street Helper, the 5K element of your application form. So it's eligible under the wider scheme, but not under this specific element of the grant scheme. It may sound obvious, but we cannot fund costs already incurred. So anything that you've paid for before you submit the application or before we've assessed your claim would not be eligible under the High Street Helper grant. And there's also certain types of shop that are specifically excluded from this. This is including but not limited to, so businesses operating under aesthetics, hair and beauty businesses, barbershops, tattoo parlours, fast food shops without a daytime offering, and any medical and dental premises. There is a slightly longer list than that, and again, when you apply to us, just give us the indication of the type of business that you're looking to establish, and we'll be able to give you feedback on whether or not that will be eligible under our funding criteria. So the High Street Helper, in terms of the 5K element as opposed to the 25K element, there are basically 4 elements that are eligible under this scheme. So rental costs, that obviously you'd know from your landlord. Business rates, something that you can find out from the online systems. You can look up any premises, identify what the rate liability would be. So those business rate costs as well. Any energy costs associated with your business. So in reality, that means electricity and gas costs for you operating that business. And also fit out costs, which basically would amount to premises preparation to allow you from move what's already there to getting yourself set up to be in the way that you want to be running your business. Most typically this would include shelving, flooring, shop counters, any decorating costs. Any of these must be costs that are not subject to planning permission. So any works that you were carrying out on the internal walls of your business that were subject to planning permission, that would not be eligible under this scheme. So internal costs not subject to planning permission. Again, anything you're not sure about when completing the application, just check with us and we'll be able to give you a steer whether or not and to what extent that will be eligible under the High Street Helper element of that. So those are the costs I mentioned before. You've got 5K to play with effectively under these. If you wanted to put all of that cost into the fit out cost and not claim against the rental, business rates or energy, absolutely fine. Similarly, if you wanted to put all of those £5,000 costs across the first 3 months into rental rates or energy costs, entirely at your discretion to do so, or perhaps a combination of the two. It's a decision for you to make in terms of how you want to spread out those grant costs within your given application. So because this is government money, it probably won't surprise you that any funding you're applying for, we would need evidence against those costs that you're proposing to make subject of your application. So in terms of rental costs, that would be a signed lease agreement. So we would want evidence that you've signed that agreement and that you've committed to taking on those premises. Business rates, as I say, anybody can look up what the liability of a given high street premises would be, and therefore what your monthly business rates are going to be. Just bear in mind the new rateable values that come in from the beginning of April 26. Just make sure that you are looking at the correct figures rather than the ones before the April date, because there may well be a change both in terms of the rate liability and also the rateable value attached to those particular premises. And also energy costs, that will be eligible. So we would need production of either a first bill or an estimated energy bill, which you're going to be liable to. Just bear in mind 95% for month 1, 50% for month 2, and then 25% for month 3. So just think about how each of those costs would taper and how that may influence what you're eligible to claim for as part of your High Street Helper application. The rent and rate element of your grant application can be paid up front once you've provided the evidence. So once you provide evidence of what your rent is going to be, what your business rates are going to be, if and when the application is approved, we'll be able to release those funds to you straight away, subject to those 3 different monthly intervention rates. Fit out costs would only be paid upon evidence of expenditure. So you would undertake the works in terms of your business, so the flooring, the shelving, the decorating, identify what those costs would be, submit evidence of those costs to us, submit evidence of payment of those costs to us, and then we would reimburse you of those costs at the eligibility rate based upon the 50% intervention rate, which they would be subject to. So what are the scheme requirements? So in terms of how you go about requesting an application forms, all applicants simply request an application form from us. There's an email address which I'll show you on the final slide of this presentation. Request an application form from us. We'll do a bit of triage with you. I mentioned about the eligibility area. We would ask you where your premises is, what type of premises you're going to be undertaking, just to ensure that when we send you the forms for the High Street Helper, you are going to be eligible for this funding and not to waste your time, quite frankly. If you pass those tests in terms of geography, location, type of business, we will send you the application form, which you then need to go away and work up, ready to submit to us. You would need to send us supporting documents that I'll come on to talk about in just a moment, and then you would send all of that information, the application form, all of the supporting documents back to us, where we will begin our assessment. So essentially, at that point, there are 3 stages actually, to the overall assessment process. The first of which would be compliance. That's just to check that we've got everything that we need from you, that all of the quotes that you've put on the application form match up with what's on your the evidence for those particular quotes, and just making sure that everything that we've got to take the application to the next stage is up and together. Once you pass through compliance, you will then move to assessment, where basically your application is assessed by a member of our team. They will prepare a short report with a recommendation, and once that process has been complete, finally you'll go through to our grant panel, where a decision will be taken on whether or not to approve your application, which hopefully, of course, it will be. During those processes, in particular the compliance and the assessment stage, it's quite likely that a member of our team will come back to you with any number of queries, just elements that we're not quite sure about, points that need clarification. Please be ready to respond to those inquiries and those queries as quickly and as fast as you can. Any delay in you getting back to us to answer those queries is just going to delay the speed at which we can bring your application to our grant panel, where you'll get your final assessment. I'm sometimes a bit reluctant to put a time scale on how long this whole process takes, but to give you sort of a broad idea, we reckon on 2 to 4 weeks from the point at which you submit the application through to you getting a final decision. The more complete and up together the application is when you submit it to us, the nearer it will be to those 2 weeks. Where we have to keep going back to you for clarification, elements missing from the application, the more likely it is to be towards the 4-week process. But hopefully that 2 to 4 weeks just gives you some idea of the range that we're looking at in order for you to be able to make a decision. If you go through those 3 processes and your grant is approved, you've then got 2 months to complete your claim. So that would mean sending us back all of your expenditure, and then evidence of that expenditure, signing your offer letter, signing your grant agreement, your funding agreement, and getting all that back to us. It's really important you do that within the 2 months, because beyond that, we may be forced to withdraw your application. So please do work to complete everything within those 2 months to make sure that your claim is up and together, and to ensure that you do get your funding as you've requested. So I mentioned already that in terms of the rent and the rates can be paid up front. Just to be aware that the pre-start grant element, so all of that equipment, all of that stock, any training, any uniform, anything like that, everything that's subject to your pre-start grant element, the 25k, is paid retrospectively. So what that means is that you would, when your grant gets approved by our grant panel, what that does basically is it gives you the green light to go ahead and incur that expenditure. So you can start spending from that point where the grant is approved, and you'll be sent your offer letter and your funding agreement. That gives you the green light to go ahead and make those purchases. As I say, you've got 2 months to go ahead and complete those purchases. But just be aware that that funding is retrospective. So you would submit back to us your evidence of expenditure with your claim form. We would then check all that's right, check your bank statements, check the evidence of expenditure, your receipts, your paid invoices, and then submit the respective amount of grant available to you back to you at that point. We typically reckon on that being a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, between you submitting your claim back to us and us being able to issue your grant, and that grant funding landing in your bank account. So just be aware that you would need the cash flow within the business itself, to make the purchase, and then secondly, in the couple of weeks before that grant comes back to you, you'll just need the cash within your business to make sure that you can make those purchases. If cash flow is a particular barrier for you, we can do stage payments. Let's say, for example, the total value of your grant is, I don't know, £10,000. If you wanted to make £2,000 worth of expenditure, claim that back, have that money in your account, make another £2,000, claim that money back, just to ease the cash flow a bit. We can do that for 2 or 3 stage payments. Anything above and beyond that does become a bit of a challenge for us. But if you wanted to break up the expenditure that you've got on your application form into 2 or 3 stage payments, then of course we can do that to ease your cash flow. We'd also need evidence of your business started. So I mentioned before that for the pre-start grant, we need to see one of 3 things, which is either registration of the business with Companies House, registration of yourself as self-employed with HMRC, or a business insurance certificate. So we would just need to see evidence that because this is a pre-start grant, you have, owing to the grant that we've awarded, gone ahead, started up and created that business essentially off the back of the grant funding. Whichever of those startup criteria you identify, it's vital that you do not do that before you submit your grant application and it's approved. So this is a pre-start grant plus the high street. So if you go ahead and start that business before we've approved your grant, again, we wouldn't be able to fund the grant application itself. So just make sure that you don't do that before you submit the application, but when you come to submit the claim, the evidence of you having created the business has been provided as we require. So a few top tips in terms of things that we like to see and what is good practice. A lot of our assessment is going to be based upon the business plan and the financial forecast, which you need to provide alongside the application form. So just ensure that these 2 documents are well constructed, they're well set out, they're evidence-based, include the things that you would normally want to see in a business plan. So for example, identifying customers, identifying target markets, identifying competition, identifying risk, just make sure that all of those elements have been thought through and are included on the business plan, because when we come to see it as a grant panel, we're basing it upon the evidence that you've got in the application form, but equally, if not more importantly, the evidence in your business plan and your financial forecast. So it's really important that those documents are really well constructed. No doubt you have growth ambitions for the business, but just be honest and realistic. So if the reality is that that business isn't going to turn a profit for the first 2 to 3 months, please put that in there, be realistic. We have seen businesses fall foul in the past where they've just been overly optimistic with their growth projections, and it doesn't look good when we come to assess it. So be honest and realistic with your growth ambitions and make sure that it's realistic in terms of what you can achieve when you're starting your business. Get help if you need it. I can't emphasize this point strongly enough, really. If you've got queries that when you start completing the application form you're not sure of, anything that sort of doesn't seem to make sense to you, please contact us and ask the question, because it's far more difficult for us to go back to you and ask questions after you've submitted the application form itself than it would be that if we were able to address those questions before you submit. So anything you're not sure of, reach out to us using the contact details at the end, and we'll be more than happy to help you through the application form and make sure that you can get it right first time around. And the final thing is just make sure that the expenditure within your application form itself is linked to your business plan and justified within the application, so the whole thing ties together. So what are you asking for as part of the grant? And just make sure that spend can be justified through your application and through the business plan itself. So the final thing then is just this I've covered the point about queries, and I mentioned earlier about where to request the application form. So startupgrant@swansea.gov.uk. So simply send an email to that address and we will return the application form straight back to you once you've been through that triage. And similarly, any points of query that you've got regarding the application itself, just make sure that you use that email address. We can always set up a separate call if that works for you to discuss any issues that you're currently working through. Throughout the year, we're going to be holding one of a number of surgeries and workshops. So if you wanted to come and sit down with us one-to-one at a desk and work through an application form with us, that opportunity will be available. So keep an eye on our social media feeds and our Business e-newsletter for where and when those surgeries and workshops are going to be taking place. And then the final thing is we're recording this video at the start of the financial year, but just keep an eye on swansea.gov.uk/business funding for any scheme updates. I don't anticipate there being any major updates, but just if you're watching this video at a later date, just check into our website just to make sure that funding is still available and that any of the criteria hasn't changed since this was recording. So that's been about a 25-minute whistle-stop tour through the High Street Helper scheme. It is a bit fiddly in so much as there are sort of two distinct elements, but as long as you keep in mind the fact that we've got two distinct elements, the pre-start grant for all of your pre-start costs and the High Street Helper for your overhead costs, I think of those two as linked but entirely separate grant funds within the same scheme, then I think you'll be along the right lines. Also bear in mind, I think importantly, your supporting documents, the business plan, the cash flow forecast, and finally, because this is a grant geared towards first-time brand new entrepreneurs, just be aware of the eligibility, that it must be a brand new business for first-time brand new entrepreneurs. That would include people not already operating a business within Swansea itself, but also the fact that this is a brand new business and hasn't been started at the point of application. So hopefully that's a useful overview for you. Look forward to receiving the application form from you in future. And that's all for today. Thank you for your time.